I'm Rob Licuria, senior editor at Gold Derby, here with Emmy winner Bear McCreary, composer on The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power. Bear, notwithstanding the inevitable, entrenched expectation from fans of what a Tolkien show would sound like, you went in a really different direction while still, keeping some degree of continuity with Howard Shore's work from the trilogies. That's a huge achievement to get right. So talk me through that challenge.
Well, I appreciate you saying I got it right. I leave that to fans and viewers. And first of all, I just want to thank you for letting me be involved with this, along with all these other incredible composers. And I think everybody on this panel today has had some experience with fan expectation. This is something that in the modern era, many of us composers deal with. More often than not these days, I'm dealing with an IP that has some kind of history. And in the case of the Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, we're making a prequel series that connects very loosely to Peter Jackson's The Lord of the Rings series, which, as you mentioned, were scored by Howard Shore. Thankfully, I didn't need to worry about any quotation. My motto was continuation, not quotation. Ultimately, we have Howard Shore involved in our show, who created this beautiful main title theme that actually kind of bridges the gap between his scores and mine. And I felt like that gave me some liberty to explore new colors. But most importantly, this is a different time period in the Lord of the Rings universe. This story that we're telling in The Rings of Power was covered in the Peter Jackson films in the first 7 minutes of the Fellowship of the Ring. So imagine getting that story, 7 minutes, spread out over truly 40 hours. So I knew I needed to bring in some new colors. I knew I needed to write new themes. We have new characters. We even have factions and realms and races that were not in those movies. So not only did I have the freedom to create something new, I really had to. My only goal was to make sure that one day, when fans watch all of our show and then go right into the Hobbit trilogy and the Lord of the Rings trilogy, they feel a sense of continuity. That was important to me. I want that as a fan. So there was a spirit to Howard Shore's writing, his orchestration, his approach to melody, his approach to lyrics and choral writing that I wanted to honor. And ultimately, I just set out with that in my mind and strove to write the best score I could.
Yeah, you could have made it completely different, and I think that probably would have been so disappointing. I do want to have some connection to the trilogies, but I was so excited about what you had in store for us, given your great background in genre television, like Battlestar and Outlander, Black Sails, Da Vinci's Demons, Foundation, one of my favorite scores. And so with this, I noticed that you have said it was a dream come true for you, and you worked for it for almost a year. Why was it a dream come true? Like, what does this mean to you to be able to work on this kind of show?
To me, The Lord of the Rings is the godfather of fantasy. It is where so many of the tropes come from. It's the literature through which many fans discover the genre. It's how I discovered the genre as a very little kid watching the animated Hobbit movies, getting to the books, and then realizing that there's this whole world there that starts to exist in your mind. It's a dream come true because, in a way, it's the ultimate fantasy environment. And I always wanted to contribute to it. And when the movies came out, the Peter Jackson movies, they brought it to life in a way that I hate to admit was even better than my childhood imagination. So in a way, like, you have the books to live up to, you have the movies to live up to, but ultimately to me it was this liberation. I just felt so free to explore and ultimately write all these character themes. I mean, that's what I love about genre writing in general, is that you need character themes and you need strong sonic identities to suspend your disbelief, to believe that you're in the mines of Moria, you're in Rivendell, you're in Valinor. You have to work a little harder to bring people along. Howard Shore did that beautifully in the films, and I felt that my thematic writing on the Rings of Power was a chance to really embrace melody the way that you can in other genres, but fantasy especially gives you freedom to dive in and write so many melodies. That's really my idea of a good time as a composer.
I totally hear you. I want to talk about some of those things, do a bit of a deep dive. There's so many to choose from, so I thought I'd just pick my favorite selfishly. Like no surprise, but the Galadriel theme is so luscious. It wavers through strings and horns and choral notes, and it slowly builds to this really heroic crescendo before it then ends with this contemplative denouement. Like, talk me through that. It's a beautiful theme.
Well, thank you. Galadriel's theme was a challenge because I wanted to create something heroic and noble, but also present an underbelly of torment. She's driven by an obsession to find Sauron when we meet her. Even when we meet her in Peter Jackson's Fellowship of the Ring or the books, there's an energy there. She is not just a peaceful, wise character like Elrond. There's a fire right under the surface that Frodo discovered. So I wanted to create something musical that had that in place. Ultimately, I had to write 17 themes for the Rings of Power's first season, which is absurd because each of them really was almost like a song from a musical or like something from an opera. Each one had a form. There was an A section, a B section, an ostinato, a development, an outro. And I wrote this hour of music before I even started. And the thing about the Galadriel theme is that every theme has a different interval at the beginning. I wanted to make sure in 2 notes you could identify which theme you're listening to. Of course, 3, 4, 5 notes helps. The color helps, what instrument it's playing in. But I wanted to make sure the first notes had a very distinct interval. So every character got a different interval, and with, sort of essentially 12 notes to choose from, and you can start going up or start going down. I had enough opening intervals, and hers opens with this minor 7 that leaps up. Da, 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 da. It's so soaring. Like I want to just do this. I want to lift up my arms when I hear it. The Strangers is a major 7. Nori gets that perfect 5th, that almost heroic but very clear perfect 5th. Sauron has, smaller diminished intervals. I really had to map this all out to make sure I didn't repeat myself, because writing 17 different themes alone is a huge challenge. The fact that any of them end up memorable or good is almost like a miracle.
I think they're all really good, but I also love Numenor because you gave us these like really unexpected, I think, Middle Eastern strings and percussion, and then it builds to another really heroic crescendo before it kind of ends on something a little softer and contemplative. Talk me through that one, because it was hard for me to understand what instruments they were.
Thank you. I take that as a huge compliment. There are a lot of Middle Eastern instruments. The melody is performed by an Armenian duduk, an Turkish yaili tambur, and a solo cello mixed together. And so the subtle blend between these very similar colors distorts, and they mask each other. They don't sound like what they are. You have Middle Eastern frame drums and changs and metallic percussion and sort of tambourine like drums. All of this is off palette for Lord of the Rings. All of this is these are colors that Howard Shore didn't typically use. And the reason I did this is that Numenor is a society that we do not experience in the Peter Jackson movies. We experience them in the Rings of Power. So I wanted to acclimate Tolkien fans to this new color. And then over the course of our show, they were going to get used to it. It's going to feel like Middle Earth. And then when they go to the Peter Jackson films, I want that sense of continuity with Howard Shore's work to come from a sense of loss. They're gone. That society isn't there anymore. This is thousands of years in the future that the movies take place. So it gave me free rein to create something different and bring in some unique colors. But ultimately, there's a sense of, I hope, Babylon and Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt, and indeed even Camelot, Atlantis. Numenor is the height of human society in Tolkien's writing.
Oh, I just love that. Vera, I could keep you here all day, but I won't do that. What we will do is bring you back for our group discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. This has been fun.
I'm Rob Licuria, Senior Editor at Gold Derby, here with Emmy nominee Tom Howe, composer for Shrinking and Ted Lasso. Tom, first of all, let's talk about Shrinking, because it features some beautiful piano work. I really love, in particular, there's one track called So Worth It. I really love that one. What do you most value about the piano as a baseline or foundation for a really great score?
Well, I often start with the piano for most things. I just find it's weirdly, when I'm writing, a lot of it's quite visual for me, and it's about the only thing that I can see the whole kind of range of everything and kind of imagine arrangements and things on. I have much more difficulty with that when I'm on a guitar, although I'm probably a better guitar player. But the piano for me is just something where I can sort of imagine what's going on before I even kind of do anything. And it's got the sound that I sort of remember growing up. That was the first thing I learned. And it's just got a very sort of pure sound, and it's just something I always gravitate towards. And in the case of Shrinking, I decided after much kind of going around the houses that the score was going to be predominantly led by keyboards, not just piano, but kind of Rhodes and kind of whirlies and all sorts of things, organs and things like that. But that the piano would be the kind of what I would do the main central theme on for Tia, who's Jason Segel's wife's character in the show. And the rest of it wouldn't really have much piano in it, so that when you heard that, it would hopefully be something that kind of stood out as something a bit different and a bit pure. And that melody sort of on the piano crops up every time we have a flashback to her. And then at the very end in that last episode, when he's talking about her at the wedding and their relationship, here in its kind of entirety there. So
it's so beautiful. Yeah, it really works. And I'm thinking also about the main song title, which includes some beautiful lyrics. And and you worked with Ben Gibbard, who, my God, I listened to him constantly when I was at university. What is that song trying to say about Jimmy, played by Jason Segel in the show?
Well, I think, it's really saying he's in a very dark place, and it can be, it's a scary place too, right? So he's grieving, and it's, when you meet the character for the first time, he's in a very dark place, but you're sort of wanting him to kind of, you're still kind of rooting for him in a way, and it's his sort of, reforming over those episodes to become a better father and sort of get in touch with himself and be a better friend to those around him. But really in the first episode, even though he's an incredibly likable person in real life, Jason, as well, but he's got a sort of smile about him and a kind of swagger that you kind of lean into. But really he's not good to his daughter, he's terrible to his friends, he's terrible to his neighbors. The first episode, he's by the pool with a couple of hookers kind of doing drugs at sort of 4 a.m. and keeping the whole neighborhood up, right? So but he's got a sort of warmth to him and a kind of redemptive arc. And, the lyrics of that song are sort of leaning into that and a sort of possibility of kind of redemption, really. But that song was a co-write obviously with Ben, and, the lyrical content, I have to tip my hat largely in his, he's a really genius in that area. And, he was amazing to work with. And we only passed it back and forth about 2 or 3 times, with kind of like, do you fancy adding this? Do you fancy adding that? And he said, I've got this idea, and I'm thinking I'm going to call it Frightening Fishes. And I was like, I love that. It sounds great. So I tip my hat to him.
It's so Death Cab for Cutie. Like, there's no one better for melancholy than Ben Gibbard. It's such a beautiful collaboration that you have with him. And then you do a similar thing, obviously, with Marcus Mumford on Ted Lasso. So, like, Frightening Fishes is I Want to Hear Myself Think Again. And then, of course, in the Ted Lasso theme, it ends with But Heaven Knows I Tried. Such really beautiful, contemplative, melancholy words there. And I'm curious, that theme song that you were nominated at the Emmys, that's pretty exciting. And I just wondering, like, when you're collaborating with people like Marcus and Ben, who have, a basis in, pop music and in alternative music, what is that like for you as a composer? Is it exciting, different, daunting? Talk me through that.
Well, it's all of those. But what for me, I always, the more sort of different jobs I do and the more people I work with in terms of, musicians, it might be a specialist kind of flute player or something like that. But each time you do something, you hopefully learn something, right? That's what I hope that I do, and you try and get better. And, working with Marcus and Ben, both times I learned something, and hopefully they may have done something, done so the other way around. But they were both actually very different experiences, because when I worked with Marcus, we met for breakfast and we got put together. And just to meet up, because Jason Sudeikis knew Marcus very well, wanted him to do the music, and I'd done 2 things for Bill Lawrence and he wanted me to do it. And so Bill said, well, why don't they do it together? So we met for breakfast and we got on, and the next thing is he invited me to his home in Devon, which from Los Angeles is about 18 hours. It's incredibly, but I went over there, and he said, just come and hang out. And I ended up staying for 10 days. I'd only met him for an hour before that. And we went into the studio every day, and he had a really cool studio. And this was just before we kind of locked down so it was early sort of 2020, and he'd come off touring, and he wanted to sort of, not have lots of people. And so he had this incredible studio. I spent the first day trying to work out how it all worked, like rewiring things around the back of the desk and trying to figure it all out. But what was really interesting was that we had no footage, we had nothing really except for calls that he'd had with Jason and notes he'd taken. And so we were very much going on vibe, and it was basically therefore like making a record rather than doing a TV show. We had nothing to go on, so we just was like, well, should we just write some songs? And so the theme song was the first thing we did. We had no other, we weren't trying to get a theme to work. That was all we had. And then we sent that off and said, well, what do you think of this? And I remember we went, after the first day, we'd sort of put down some ideas. I went away that night and he'd done this lyric in the first verse, and I was trying to write the second verse, and we were having a glass of wine over something at dinner. And we came back, sent it off, and they said, well, we love it. And that was how it kind of came out. And then everything else sort of stemmed from that. As with On Shrinking, by the time we got to the main title, I was probably halfway through doing the score. So I had tunes, and actually both sort of very different approaches. And even though Shrinking was after COVID, I actually have to this day, I've still yet to meet Ben in person. I've only met him on Zoom. So that was different again. So Marcus and I had this very concentrated period together, and Ben and I had phone calls, but he's just unbelievable. Well, both of them are unbelievable singers, but they've got very different voices. And I think they both really suit the kind of shows and, the different ideas behind them, really. So they're great experiences.
Can you imagine watching Ted Lasso without that? Yeah, when the opening title starts, it's just so iconic now. And it's so beautiful. So final question is something you've probably discussed before, but I'm so interested to know this because you're really good at steering clear of cheesy, inspirational underdog music when we have the action scenes in Ted Lasso when they're playing football. Thank God. How difficult are those things to get right?
It's actually really difficult, and that's the bit I probably spend the longest on. In terms of sometimes I find the more emotional things and are much easier for me to sort of tap into. But on some of those sporting moments, as you say, particularly when I tried to. A lot of the rest of the show is acoustic guitars, mandolins, piano. And in the sporting moments, generally, because you need more sounds, electric guitars, bass and drums with some other things going on. But automatically, when you start putting that down, you've got to be very, very careful that you don't start making it too cheesy. And so, that's probably the biggest challenge doing the sporting moments and trying to kind of, work out how much you're going to hit picture-wise or how much you're going to play through, and, whether you're going to mark the narrative too much or just give a general overall kind of, mood of what's going on. And these are conversations. I mean, fun enough, when we spot Ted Lasso, we do these Zooms, and there's probably like 16 or 17 people on the Zoom. It's more than anything that I do. And we debate these things for hours. I mean, the spots last 4 hours, minimum for kind of like the first, though we sometimes break them down into other bits. But, Jason has a very, very clear idea of what he is looking for most of the time, and that's incredibly helpful, obviously, to have someone who and sometimes it's not musical, but he'll describe a feeling he wants or what he's looking to achieve, and it's definitely a good guide to kind of get you going.
Oh, for sure. When you have that confluence of talent and it kind of ups your A game, and on this and on Shrinking, you absolutely did that. Tom, thank you for your time. We will see you soon in our group chat.
Look forward to it. Thank you.
I'm Rob Licuria, Senior Editor at Gold Derby, here with Stephen Barton, composer for Star Trek Picard. Stephen, when you joined the show with new showrunner Terry Matalas, who you've worked with before, You both elevated the show into something more cinematic, I think. You eventually also brought on Frederick Weidman for the final 4 episodes. So what was behind the decision, though, to treat the music for season 3 like a really long, epic theatrical film?
I think the biggest part of that was a general sense that this cast never quite got their undiscovered country moment, and so we never. I mean, the final 3 Next Gen movies were great, but it was like they never got the send off and the final shot and the final moment, and sort of neither did the ship really, because they kind of crashed it on a planet and sort of said bye to the saucer section, and that was that. So I think, everybody wanted to say, right, we may never get to play with any of this material ever again. What can you do? And a really nice moment to also take a step back from the entire franchise and say, what does this thing that's been around for half a century now, what does this mean? And looking to the movies as well, the original movies, the original series, and all of the music and the entire legacy, and saying, how can we write a love letter to the whole thing? So that was really the main motivation behind it.
And love letter it was. It's so funny that you say that undiscovered country moment. That is my favorite Trek ever. And I felt like we needed to see that for the TNG cast, who to me are like just legends. When you occasionally infuse those iconic Goldsmith cues in this score, it just filled my heart with joy, because it gave me that nostalgia. It was very appropriate for what we were watching. And then, of course, you took it into other directions. So talk me through the way in which you included those cues in the overall musical aesthetic for season 3.
Well, I think the main thing there was that we wanted to not only just sort of like press the button, as it were, sort of be like, okay, here's a tune I'm very familiar with, but really go back to the ethos of how James scored films, particularly when they came back to Trek. And Jerry, in particular, I think never really saw walls between the films. So you have the busy man motif from Star Trek V, which is became really very much a Commander Data thing later on, and there's a lot of other sort of cross-pollination between them, and so I think one of the things we tried to do was sort of say, okay, well, let's not just look at the tunes themselves, but the ethos of how they were scored and the approach. And you have everything from the sort of bombast of like some of the Ron Jones episodes, Best of Both Worlds, the end of season 2, I think it was, of Next Gen, to Dennis McCarthy's work, to Leonard Rosamond, to Cliff Idleman, and saying, okay, well, let's try and infuse this with a bit of that. So there's sort of homages all the way through it, really, but it's not really even just in the moments where the themes are playing, but just from I think the approach of how we get in and out of dialogue, how we weave between scenes, and I think the biggest thing was then also treating it very much in a way that a lot of TV can't be treated, because if you're making 10 hours of television, then the chances of you writing 9 hours of music for that is most shows would just be, they would look at like you were a crazy person, and you just wouldn't have the time even if you wanted to. But we basically set out to do that at the very outset of this and said, let's not have any unloved children. We don't really have a sort of episode 5, episode 6 sort of fetch and carry episode where there's sort of side quests galore and no one really cares, and we can sort of there just is that in this season. So we had to basically treat every moment like a fresh moment. So and try and sort of give it a whole arc such that you get that satisfaction from the ending. And the biggest wonderful thing as well is that we kind of knew there was an ending here, and that gives you a lot of freedom as a composer, because there's things that you leave open-ended a lot of the time otherwise, where you can actually write towards the climax, and that's so much great music is written with the ending in mind, and you feel it in the score. So that I think that's very liberating, and it's a wonderful thing to have.
Yeah, I'm still in denial that it's ending. In my mind, it's still going. And if Star Trek Legacy does become a thing, please put your hand up and return to the franchise. Okay, just putting that out there, just manifesting.
We'd love to make it. I mean, it's definitely something that it's on the cards. It's a possibility, but who knows? I mean, the franchise is such an interesting stage now as well, with Section 31 and Starfleet Academy and a bunch of things happening potentially. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see where it goes.
Just got to see. Now, deep dive. Most people who listen to this soundtrack would probably say Leaving Space Dock is that one track that they always remember as just being such a standout. I totally agree. It opens with this rousing adaptation of the TNG theme, and then it transitions into this inspirational wave of orchestral sounds that ducks and dives into old school flourishes and pensive moments. It's so wonderful. Talk me through that track.
I think, well, the biggest thing in that track was we knew, obviously it parallels several scenes that have already happened in particularly in the movies. And so what we wanted to do there was actually sort of bring back a bit of the nauticality that sort of James Horner brought to the equation, and sort of has this, there's echoes of sort of Walton and Henry V in a lot of Horner's work, and there's a lot of sort of elements of Prokofiev as well, and but there's this overriding sense of like this is both the sort of the Starfleet of family, but it's also a military organization. At the end of the day, it's basically a ship. It's a ship leaving port, and so you want a little bit of that sort of Horatio Hornblower thing going on. And that's very much was sort of part of Wrath of Khan. It was very much part of Star Trek 3 as well, and so that I think for us was our moment there to sort of basically go back to like where this is a ship with a captain at the end of the day, and it's like there's a hierarchical command structure here, and they're on a mission at the end of the day. So that's, I think that was what we liked from the Horner scores, that they really had that feeling to it. So bringing those orchestrational elements in and really writing this as a moment. I mean, the shot that defines that scene for me is Jerry Ryan sits back in the chair before she says engage and sort of breathes out and just takes a little moment. It's a superb performance because you see the weight of like the honor she's just been given. Like, here, you can take the ship out of port, and there's this tradition and this legacy there. And so that, I think we're playing to that. It's like if you had to sum that cue up, it's like, I think Terry literally spotted it like this. He said, like, if you want to know what this needs to feel like musically, just look at that 3 seconds moment where she just sits back in her chair and you see the weight of what she's doing hit her. So that's really what that's about.
It's so good. When you put your headphones on and you turn the album on, the first track is Beverly Crusher, and that really is my favorite, honestly. Percussive, deep string cue with pensive action melody overlaid over the top of it. It's such a perfect way to open the score. What inspired that one?
Well, there we're setting up a couple of things. Well, firstly, I mean, we knew right at the outset the Beverly gets her moment right at the beginning, and this was, I think the way Terry wanted to set his flag in the sand, which was like the character you least expect to be doing what she's doing, kicking ass basically. So we, but one of the things we introduced there very subtly was we knew we wanted a motif that would run through the entire season for the Changeling conspiracy, and so that actually is introduced in there in the rhythmic, and it's a very sort of typical Goldsmithian thing of it's like a cue, and it's in 13/8, and it has like shifting rhythms and shifting meters going on, and so we kind of wanted to immediately set out the stall of saying, okay, this isn't some sort of straight 4/4 sort of thing you're expecting. This is you're nowhere near what you're expecting, what was going to come up. So and this sort of jarring moment of and also giving her like a moment of sort of kind of the kind of heroism that she never actually kind of got in the series. She was always the voice of reason and the voice of there. She never really got to sort of kick ass, even in the movies particularly. She was always the gentle character. So it's just great to see her get her moment. So that was very much all that was about.
And final one is the Shrike. Every time we saw the Shrike, we had that really fantastic sound that was used to kind of tell us, yes, the Shrike has arrived. Amanda Plummer as like a changeling. Oh my God. And then this track is ethereal, it's alien, mysterious, and then bam, it goes into something really unusual. I couldn't actually pick what instruments were primarily responsible for that track, but it's a nice one. I really love it.
So that's actually a cool callback to something, we very much wanted to go back to working with Craig Huxley, who plays this thing called the Blaster Beam. And Craig is, was played on the original motion picture soundtrack, played on 2, 3, I think 5. Certainly has been, he was actually in Star Trek as a kid. He was an actor. He was in an episode where he turned out to be an evil child, I think. But anyway, so he's tremendous. And it was one of those things we knew for that sound, we wanted a bit of that kind of otherworldly thing. So there's various layers of things we did with him Warner Brothers, and basically just trying to find some sort of unusual sound, and the idea really with the changelings was we wanted to to evoke this kind of ancientness with them, because you want something that doesn't feel human, but also doesn't feel like it's sort of devolved sort of out of human society either. And so a lot of the instrumentation there is either processed to stuff where we recorded it sort of very high sample rates and pitched it down a lot, so it doesn't sound, it sort of sounds organic, but you're not quite sure what it is. Or it's something we did with Craig, and there's a big sort of car crash of like sounds at the very, very beginning of each time the Shrike comes on screen, which is about 5 layers of him pounding the crap out of this awesome instrument that just makes sounds that like you can't really get any other way. So and that was very much an homage as well to motion picture soundtrack, which he was instrumental in making the sound of.
Yeah, absolutely. That sound for the Shrike, I just lived for it. It was so great. Stephen, thank you for your time. We'll bring you back for the group chat shortly.
Thank you very much.
I'm Rob Licuria, Senior Editor at Gold Derby, here with Oscar nominee John Powell, composer for Still, a Michael J. Fox movie. John, you're renowned for these beautiful, big, bombastic scores like How to Train Your Dragon, Solo, Happy Feet, the Bourne films, just to name a few. And then you're tapped to compose for this documentary. And ordinarily I'd be asking, how did you adapt your work for something that's very different? It's not a narrative feature, but you didn't approach this like a documentary, did you?
Well, I didn't really know how to. I only did it because I liked Davis so much, and Michael is an extraordinary sort of subject matter. I really truly got lost in the sense that I'm used to narrative structure that is, constructed, as opposed to sort of found, which I think is what documentary. I honestly cannot speak with any kind of expertise on documentaries, because I guess I've watched them all my life. I've loved them, but I've never really thought of doing music for them. They always seemed a different beast. So this was, I think, Davis thinking, okay, well, this guy is much more of a sort of a film guy, and we've got a subject which is about who does films, so maybe apply that concept to it. I think, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, the music on this film could have been melancholy and contemplative, but I'm so glad you didn't take it in that direction. Davis, the director, mentioned to Gold Derby actually that he wanted the music to be big and sound like an 80s movie, which is so appropriate. So what inspired some of those choices? Because they work beautifully for the film.
Well, there is 80s music in it, a lot of it.
Yes.
And there's some 80s one of the best scores of all time, which is from Michael's breakout film, Back to the Future, which is Alan Silvestri. So I didn't do, I wish I had written that, but I didn't. But the thing that I did is everything else that seems to just kind of mostly about watching a man who has always moved so kind of lithely. I just kind of kept that going. I kept this idea that he's dancing through his life. I do the dance thing quite often. I mean, I've done it a lot. I've talked about it, doing it on action films. But this is an actual man who basically is kind of moving constantly since he was born. And the whole idea of the film is that it took Parkinson's to sort of get him to calm down.
Yeah, it's so true. And then the opening sequence is really unusual. It employs this ambitious and compelling instrumentation. I think as he's in his bed, noticing his hand twitch and then goes into the MRI and things like that, where we're just getting a sense of how he discovered this disease and how it affected his life. What was behind some of the choices as a palate cleanser for the journey that we're about to go on with him?
Well, there's a lot of electronic stuff in that one, really, so it's sort of almost like sound design and things. And Davis liked that. We didn't ever discuss it, but I think it was just something I was fiddling around with, and he was attracted to it. But one of the things that is there, and sort of is is thematic, as it were, is that they were talking about trying at the beginning that kind of that whistle effect that sound effects guys put in when bombs have just gone off. And I said, well, why don't I try it with a violin, really high violin? If you play a high harmonic on a violin and you put the microphone too close to the, the violin, you get this really weird whistle, but plus this kind of really grungy sound as you try and pull horsehair over a piece of very, very tightly strung metal on the E string. And so I found some samples, and we liked the idea. So the irony of that was that one of the things that Michael had said to Davis when he agreed to do it, he said, okay, I'll do it, but as long as there's no violins, which of course he meant no, nothing sappy. And that is definitely what we were trying to do. But I love the idea of having this almost the theme that was started as the devil, the pain that he was going to suffer from Parkinson's, this high painful noise. And then through the movie, I use it quite a few times, and then it sort of appears again right at the end. And I think you realize that it's the idea was that it sort of comes out of a very pretty piece of violin, writing, which then goes it goes up and up and up and up and ends up on the same note. So I don't know if people get that, but that was the theory of it, which is, that was Davis's thing, is that how do you take a disease and that's as debilitating and actually gain grace from it? And that was their idea.
And that's the point, exactly. I typically don't read about the composer's thought process and stuff. I just like to come into these interviews pretty clean, just from what I can hear. And I'm thinking that's an organic sound, but it's not. And it made me feel uneasy. And it's so interesting that you're using a violin, which normally you would play for when someone's sad or melancholy, and you're able to kind of turn it on its head. That's so fascinating. And then, of course, when he's in, when we're seeing, for example, the control room at the live taping, when people are laughing on set and we see Fox's ascent to stardom, it's exciting and uplifting. And I'm just wondering, what's the key to uplifting the audience by eliciting excitement? Because you're very good at that, and you've done that a lot in your narrative features.
I don't know. I listen as a kid. I used to listen to a lot of ballet music, classical ballet music, Russians and French ballet music, and I always found the joy in it. I think that's one of the things that's always attracted me to music is the joy I felt. I find that to be quite transcendent. So I just always look for the joy, and I think Davis heard that in lots of scores, and even though he didn't want a big bombastic score, he wanted the same joy, I think, in it. So I had a smaller ensemble, but I guess I couldn't help myself. It came out joyful.
Yeah, it absolutely does. How does it work with a composer when you have obviously a lot of music supervision or direction on the project as well? Obviously, this employs a lot of themes from Fox's movies, a lot of songs from the 80s, and that's interspersed with your original music. And sometimes they're so blended that you don't know where one starts and one ends, which I think is really, really nice. It's really appropriate for what we're watching. But is that challenging for the composer?
No, it's really easy, actually, because, when it works, when the songs work and everybody's, and they've been able to get the rights, that's the tricky one. The only tricky thing about it is sometimes you want to, because part of the job is to sort of just like smooth everything out, get in and get out things, and just do that. I mean, I've done that a lot in my career, but the great one is when you do it, it's perfect, and then they call from the dub and they say, oh, we had to change the song and it's in a different key, and it sounds like you just crashed into the song. But in this case, they cleared everything. Randy Post is brilliant, and he'd done all of this, and Davis and the editor, I mean, it was all done for me. I was like, I didn't really have to do any of that other than just make sure that I didn't clash with it. I also didn't clash tonally with it. So when it's already in existence, you're just sort of being a craftsman. You're trying to be a craftsman. But when it doesn't exist and you're part of it, I mean, I don't really do that kind of thing, but occasionally, like on Happy Feet, I'm involved in all the songs, all the music. I have to sort of help construct that as we go along. But no, that was the easy bit. The harder bit was just documentaries. It's really hard.
Oh, I can only imagine. I love this movie so much. It's so beautifully done. And John, thank you so much for your time today. We'll bring you back shortly for our group chat.
Pleasure.
I'm Rob Licuria, Senior Editor at Gold Derby, here with Emmy nominee Ingrid Michaelson, composer for Tiny Beautiful Things. Ingrid, not only did you compose the beautiful music for this show, but you wrote and recorded a new original song for the series finale, Not Gone, and covered the Indigo Girls' Close to Fine for the series premiere. So I'm curious, how does your experience as a vocalist and songwriter inform how you wanted to approach composing the score for the series?
Well, I was approached by Liz Tigelaar, the showrunner, who I worked with before, and she's been a fan of my music as a songwriter for years and years. And she asked me to score the show, and I said, I looked behind, I was like, me? You asking me? I've never done it before. And she said, I want your essence, I want you. And I said, I can try, and I teamed up with two great other artists, Juan Ariza and Gabriel Mann. And basically, for me, melodies come first anyway, before lyrics. So I would watch a scene and I would sit at my piano and I would just play and play and play and play. And I would have about, 10 voice notes, and I would send them to Juan and to Gabe, and they would sort of sift through things. This was all while I was actually working on my musical in Chicago. I'm writing a musical too, so it was a little hectic. There were some voice notes of me on my ukulele on the stage while people were on their lunch break. It was pretty wild but the timing was so that I had to multitask. So I found myself sort of writing words anyway. I would sort of mumble them, and I was like, don't use the words, just the melodies, just the themes. So it was an interesting process for me, because as I said, the melodies always come first, and then the melodies inform the words, but I didn't really get a chance to finish. So that's why I was really excited about writing an original song for the piece, because I got to actually, have some words come out to match the melodies that were also coming out. But it's my first time doing it, and it was kind of magical. It's really, really amazing. And the storyline of the show is a very close parallel to my life in some ways. So it was very, to use an overused word, cathartic in many ways for me.
And it's so interesting that those of us who listen to the music and watch the series also go through our own catharsis, and the music is so it's so appropriate for the show. What kind of surprised me was how the show it walks this delicate, fine tonal line between comedy and drama. Although I shouldn't have been too surprised. It's Catherine Hahn, and she's so good at that. So it's profound, and then it makes me laugh out loud. And so I'm just wondering what you thought of that dynamic when it came time to write the music for it.
Well, I shine in moments of sorrow and sadness. That's where I'm like, dun, da, da. So the moments with levity, really, it kind of came down to certain instruments that we used. Like Juan used this baritone tenor guitar in kind of a plucky way, and it's like, obviously the notes he's playing are important, but it's also the intention behind the notes and how he's playing it and the sort of pluckiness. And so we peppered in those moments where we needed them, but for the most part, I feel like the meaty, heavy parts of the show that really required score were the more emotional, not always sad, but the heavy emotional moments. So yeah, that was where I really stuck the knife in, so to speak.
Yeah, so to speak. My favorite track on the album is Tiny Beautiful Sequence. And for people who don't recall, that starts off with this minimal piano melody. It's overlaid by this evocative string element, and then there's this unexpected, like, strumming percussive guitar that fills out the sound that I think you've alluded to. I love this track. What inspired the melancholy, contemplative sound that I assume you were going for?
I wrote that piano theme on a keyboard in Chicago upstairs in a rehearsal space, and I sent it to Juan and to Gabe. And basically, Gabe kind of was like, I think we need to pull some strings into this. Juan says, I think we need to pull some guitar into this. And the three of us just meeting of the minds, figure out, piece it together, what goes where. But it was interesting because we would send in some completed songs, and our music editor would sort of push them into another scene, possibly, which sometimes worked and sometimes didn't work. And when it didn't work, it just it would itch my skin a little bit. I was like, well, it's beautiful, I get it, but that's not where I wanted that. And so there was a little bit of sort of some always lovely, very gracious push and pull, but each major chunk theme was definitely, it always started with something I would send to Gabe and to Juan, and they would weave it together with their amazing brains. So I cannot take total credit for anything, for everything. I can take some credit for something.
Okay, that's very humble.
Yeah.
So I found it interesting that years ago, when you were really just breaking through as a singer-songwriter, your songs were, featured on various TV shows. Example, Grey's Anatomy, most people would remember that. And years later, you're then nominated at the Emmys for your song "Build It Up" from Little Fires Everywhere. That's a really nice kind of coming around full circle as an artist in the TV space, I should say, really. What was that like to be nominated for an Emmy?
It was very unexpected because I've been doing this for 20 years. It's like, I don't know. I don't know why some people get recognized and some people don't. I mean, obviously, I know why some people get recognized and some don't, but it was like, part of me was like, oh, I can't believe this is actually happening. And then part of me was like, why hasn't this happened already? Just because it's you work. And so to be recognized in that way, it might not make total sense to you, but it was a pretty 50-50 split of I can't believe it, and finally, you know what I mean? There was a little denial, not me, I'm not good enough, no. And then the other side that was hyping me up. So it was really lovely, and I loved working on that show. I got to really sort of delve into those characters and craft something pretty special and really specific, which is kind of similar to what I did with the song for Tiny Beautiful Things. There's all these Easter eggs in there that if you know the show, if you've watched the show, I wrote it. It's a love letter for the show, really.
Yeah, Not Gone is such a great track. I love that. What is it about working with Liz Tigelaar that inspires this greatness from you, Ingrid? What is that?
She believes in me. She believes in me, and sometimes that's all you need is somebody who's gonna be in your corner and have your back and believe in you. And when she first asked me about scoring, I was like, I don't know what you're talking about. I play piano and ukulele and I write music, but score? And she's like, we can figure it out. I just want you. I want your melodies. And I would have never thought that this was even in the realm of possibility for me. To be in this panel with these other humans is mind-blowing to me. So, and it's, and I have a great support system, my manager, my family, but Liz really believed in me and wanted my sound. And, the Catherine Hahn's character, she lost, it's all about her dealing with the loss of her mother and from when she was, younger. And I lost my mom, years ago. And so I think she wanted that heartbreaking authenticity to come through. So yeah.
Yeah, and it really, really does. I'm so glad she did bring you on. It's a beautiful score. Thank
Thanks.
you for your time, Ingrid. We're going to bring you back now for the group chat. I'm Rob Licuria, Senior Editor at Gold Derby, and I am delighted to be joined by the following composers: Ben McCreary, who composed the score for The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power; Tom Howe, who composed the scores for Shrinking and Ted Lasso; Stephen Barton, who composed the score for Star Trek Picard; John Powell, who composed the score for Still, a Michael J. Fox movie; and Ingrid Michaelson, who composed the score for Tiny Beautiful Things. Welcome everybody to the panel. I'm so excited to have you all on board. Now, here's my first question. We're going to go a little deep, because a film or TV show is so often most effective and potent as an art form when it makes us feel something. Fear and joy and sadness and all those beautiful emotions. And of course, it's the composer that has to do it. It's your job to elicit that from our heart and soul. So what are the best ways for a good score to elicit certain emotional responses in a TV show? Who would like to regale me with their thoughts first? Bear, I think it's you.
I'll go first. That's a great question. And my mentor when I started in the business was a composer named Elmer Bernstein, who is one of the most famous film composers of all time. And I learned a lot from him. But the thing that I learned that I use every day is he said over and over, there's only one thing you ever need to ask a filmmaker. What do you want the audience to feel? Don't ask them about instruments, don't ask them about themes, don't ask them about the temp. Just ask them that. And I have found that has bailed me out of a jam every time. That actually is fundamentally the job, is answering that question. And yes, we have various tools at our disposal, but I mean, I think even more fundamentally, we have to understand the task, the nuance of what you want the audience to feel. Then it's our job to go find the different colors and harmony and melody and rhythm and spotting and volume and all this stuff that is technical. But ultimately, if we don't know what the director or the showrunner wants the audience to feel, then we're lost. I'm curious to, if everybody else has a similar philosophy. How do you guys approach it?
I think one of the biggest challenges I think you often have to find out is the simple art of knowing, even when to not play things. And as filmmakers, we are first and foremost, or filmmaker, television, whatever, music synchronized with media. Irrespective of whether it's a video game or even a TV show or a film, you're fundamentally trying to ask the question of like, what's already there, because it's a team sport at the end of the day, and I've been a great believer that a lot of the time I love music where it's not that I don't notice it, it's that I don't notice it being separate, and I notice a single cohesive experience where I sit in the movie theater or play a video game or whatever, and all I know of is there's the marriage of the two is something you would never want to put aside. And I think one of the best examples of that, and I often use my big test is my daughter. She's 9, and when I watch her reaction to something, because she's not sort of cynical or doesn't have any of the baggage of having sort of watched loads of movies, I with a moment where Hiccup flies out in Dragon and flies down in the test drive sequence and emerges from the bottom and that theme kicks in. I just watch the joy on her face and I'm like, okay, that's what we're doing. That's our job. Our job is to evoke that. It's the goosebumps on the back of your neck. It's all of those moments. And without ever saying like, look at me, I'm the music, and the music is the thing here that you should only be listening to. Ignore this visual nonsense. You're never doing that. You're always part of a team and part of a greater whole. So.
Well, okay. Well, on that note, John, I'm curious to see what you have to say about eliciting emotion.
If I'd known all this stuff when I started, I would have done a lot better, I think. That sounds really good.
Yeah.
I mean, you're supposed to. I don't know. The two things is that I wanted to write music, and then I discovered that you can't make any money from it. So if you lend yourself to filmmaking, you know, you get some money and you get to work with the best musicians and in great studios. The downside of that is they want it to fit the picture. They want it to fit emotionally, and they want it to fit, you know, visually. So it's sort of a mixture of, for me, it's always been I love the inspiration of the film to try and write things. But then, you know, it's quite hard because you really have to realize you're a collaborator and that it's about the story.
Yeah, that makes sense. I like that. Tom?
Well, I think that's, I mean, kind of without the picture, I don't know how I would, or, you know, some semblance of what it is that someone was wanting. I don't know how I would start. But I think that one of the things I've got quite into in the last couple of years is that, you know, sometimes you do a film and you have a melody that kicks in, you've got a big orchestra and you can go somewhere like Abbey Road, but sometimes you don't have that budget and you haven't got that, and you have to find other ways to bring the emotion in. And one of the best things that I picked up working with Marcus, interesting, when we had those 10 days together, was that I was most concerned about what theme was going to be, that basically what the notes were and how it was going to go with the picture. And what he was most concerned about was what microphone we were using and how we were going to put it through the desk to give the warmth in the sound that he wanted. I mean this in a total and when you mic a piano really well and you've got it and it sounds really warm, it has a kind of depth and an emotion in it that you do not get from a kind of, you know, a MIDI kind of mock-up of whatever. And ditto if you put the right vocals with stuff. And so in the last couple of years, I've got really into actually how I sort of redid my whole setup of how I had things, in terms of I try when I've got small sounds to make sure that everything is always, you know, played in some way. The downside of that is when they do change the picture, which they do all the time, I find it much harder to fix it. But I love that feeling of trying to get the best guitar sound I can for a said moment. And you know, how that might make you feel. Obviously it's the notes as well, but trying to kind of get the best kind of, or as John just said there, the best performance right now, whether that's with a big orchestra in, you know, Abbey Road 1, or whether it's just, you know, a solo guitar or solo mandolin. You just want it to kind of sound as good as it can. And I think that brings an emotional quality to things as well, that, you know, hopefully elevates the music and makes it marry better with the picture and all the rest of it in the stories.
Absolutely. Ingrid, you're up.
I think that using in Tiny Beautiful Things, we really leaned a lot on this one baritone tenor guitar, and it's sort of its sound and its woody, creaky sound. And I think there's something about having a familiar instrument that pops back up, that you as the viewer, the goal is not to be like, hey, we're using that guitar again. It's more to elicit a sort of pinging in the brain of something familiar that I know, that I've heard before, that I know that texture, and it obviously is complementing whatever is visually happening. It's not just there for, you know, can't say for poop and giggles. There we go. It's there for a reason. Can I curse?
Shits and giggles. Yeah.
Shits and giggles. There we go. I also felt like when we used my vocals was very precious. In my solo work, I'm always layering and harmonizing, and I can't stop. It's bad. You have to stop me. So with this, I wanted to really be really careful, because when you hear a human voice, at least for me, that does something to me also, something sort of innately human when you hear another human, even if it's oohing and eyeing and there's no lyrics. So that was another thing that I felt was these little emotional moments that you could have with the audience through my vocals, and peppering those where we needed them.
Yeah, and what a difference some of the beautiful oohings and ahhings that you've used, Ingrid, compared to like what Bear's doing on a track like Kazakh Doom or Nampat, where they're just kind of like, you know, it's it works. It's beautiful
It's the
and
same thing.
scary.
I mean, Ingrid's totally right. The human voice is such a powerful tool in our arsenal. You know, a color on our paintbrush, so to speak. And I definitely lean heavily on that. They can communicate text, which also can carry a lot of meaning, even if you don't understand it. You can feel that there's meaning. But Ingrid, you said something else that really resonated with me. That I was thinking. Also, Tom, when you were talking about like the sound of the piano, right? That in a way, there's like this Pavlovian effect that happens. We condition the audience to have certain emotions. Some of it's innate, right? You hear a certain solo cello playing something, and you know maybe that feels happy or sad. But what's so interesting about film is we can reassign that pretty quickly. Certain characters occur, and it's almost like I'm going to use this sound or this theme on this person, use it once, and it's like, oh, that's interesting. A second time, I'm starting to connect. For me, 3 is the magic number. You use it 3 times, the audience now understands that these things are related. There's something on screen, whether it's a character or an arc or a subplot or something, and a sound. And then once you've taught them that, you can play with it, and you set it in different contexts, and you can mess around with it, and they've kind of assigned, at least in the world of just your show, that this sound has this meaning. And I'm fascinated by that. I love that. So you can have a sound that you hear in different projects, and they mean completely different things, because I think as composers, we intuitively understand that we're sort of teaching the audience the language that we're going to speak for this particular project. And then we kind of don't break those rules once we set them up.
Actually, and one of the joys of as a job is that there is no right answer. There's no right piece of music for a particular piece of film and a wrong piece of music. There's just the way you react to it and our experience of it. So, you know, I think one of the nice things about writing for these kinds of projects is often the both the joy and the terror of the blank page, and the sort of this idea that you can basically go anywhere. You just have to sort of kind of be able to sort of justify it in your own mind, or to whoever is paying you, to what you're trying to do, and whether that is enhancing the experience. And so, you know, and I think, you know, certainly when I was studying music as when I was young, I was like, it was one of those things where that I knew I didn't want to sit in a practice room and be an instrumental musician very much, because I just did the sort of the loneliness of that didn't really appeal to me. But the team nature of what we do, I think is wonderful, and the fact that you can have people who, you know, don't necessarily have a musical vocabulary, but they can often have the greatest insight into what you're doing as a composer, and ask you questions and suggest things, and hopefully, you know, when you have a good experience, because they're not always good, but when you do, you get the ability to say, you know, have someone say something really insightful that didn't include a piece of musical vocabulary at all, but just gave you a really sort of interesting insight into what you're trying to write.
Absolutely. It's so true. Now, before I let you guys go, I want to ask you what your favorite score is of all time. I have to do that as a film nerd. It's part of it's and TV nerd, obviously. It's just compulsory. Mine's modern. Mine's Michael Nyman's The Piano. And yeah, for various reasons. And Abel Kozianowski's A Single Man. We'll love that as well. What about you? What are your favorite scores of all time? What do you love? What inspires you the most?
I'll go first, I guess. To me, the score that isn't my favorite, but maybe inspires me the most, is Elmer Bernstein's To Kill a Mockingbird, which is the score that, to me, defined what modern film scoring sounds like. It came out in 1960, but if you said James Horner wrote that in 1992, or someone wrote it this year, you would go, yeah, no, that sounds right. It was massively ahead of its time. My personal favorite score, though, is Basil Polidorus' Conan the Barbarian. That's
I love that. I love Basil. Who else?
My favorite, when I was in 8th grade and I was sitting in social studies class, and my teacher was cool, and he played us the movie Glory. We got to watch it over the span of 3 days. That score, I'm such a melody, I'm just a melody head. Arrangements are not, that's not my forte, but that score, it sunk me. So it got into my bones when I think I was 13 years old. And I learned it on the piano, and I would just like, I would sit at the piano and play it and cry. Like it, because I would then attach it to, spoiler alert, them dying at the end and being buried in the grave together. But just that main theme, the dun da 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 dun da 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 dun da da da, like it makes me want to cry now, so many years later. And I just I'm a sucker for swooping melodies, and that movie just stuck with me and has always stuck with me and is like the benchmark.
That's beautiful. John.
Depending on the day, I tell people different ones, because there's lots of really good ones. One of the ones I tell people is Dog Day Afternoon, because that's got no score and it doesn't need it at all. Or because like 5 seasons of The Shield, not a single piece of score in it. It works well. But the one I think probably always you'll get me on is Babe, which uses a theme by Saint-Saëns, who I believe wrote a film score or something like in 1901 or something, before there was almost film. And he didn't write that way. He just wrote an organ concerto, and that tune was used and arranged brilliantly. And I just remember the film, starting out watching it on the plane, and it starting with all these weird accents. I didn't understand the accents. I didn't know it was George. I didn't know George Miller had made it. I didn't know it was any of these things. And I was like, what is going on? I really didn't go. But when that tune started, and I talked to George Miller later about it, is like he just said, I said, where did you end up with that? He said, well, he said, I don't know, but I just knew that was the soul of the character. That's all. And so I think when I watched it on a plane, I just suddenly it all clicked, and then I was in rapture all the way to the end. And when he wins, it's one of those moments I can hardly even think of without bursting into tears. So
I know, and an Australian classic too, John. Thank you. All right, what about you, Stephen?
I don't honestly listen to a huge amount of film music, but certainly sort of separated. I would only really ever watch it with the film, but I would say probably of scores, if you push me, I would probably say Close Encounters, just because I think it's like just in terms of what it did, it was so wildly ahead of its time, and just the way it's structured and the way it marries so perfect. It's so overt, but also so perfect. It's not something. There's no point at which the music takes over. It's just the marriage of the two is perfect and seamless. And so I think that's always been a benchmark of just actual scores that I think work brilliantly.
Total sci-fi classic. Tom, you get the final say.
Well, I love all things Ennio Morricone, literally, but I think the score that probably I remember having the most influence on me actually was the original John Williams Superman. And it's very obviously motive heavy, but it kind of I remember he states the theme in the very opening, just this root fifth kind of thing that then turns into the main theme, and he's got sort of very odd harmony kind of underneath it, and it all feels quite otherworldly. And then you have these electronics on Krypton and kind of these huge sort of brass things going on, and then he goes to Smallville, it's like old Americana kind of like amazing string writing, and then you go to sort of with Metropolis, and it's different again, and then you've got that kind of march that you kind of remember, but it's sort of had everything for me, and I thought it was a really just brilliant writing, but the orchestration was just unbelievable. And a huge fan of his across everything he did obviously as well, but I remember that one having a particular impact, and I just remember thinking, God, this is such a wide palette, the stuff at the beginning, kind of like early electronics, and then kind of going forward from there. But it's probably that one.
That's a good choice. I think you all made some beautiful choices. Thank you so much for sharing your insights today. This has been a real dream for me. I love talking to composers. I really appreciate your time. Congratulations on some beautiful work.
Thank you. This has been fun.
Thanks for having me.